Hey guys, so I haven't done a video in a long time. Like, I've been gone like almost 3 months now. So I thought maybe it was about time to come back and talk about all the albums that have come out that I've listened to and not dedicated a full review to. A couple of these I am planning on doing a more in-depth review of in the future, but for now I'm just going to go through this list of albums as quickly and sharply as I possibly can without rambling on about stuff, without giving it a long review, just basically quick firing through all these albums.
I grew up in Streatham. Teachers were giving man tests. Same time the man them were giving out testers.
So I will admit I'm not the biggest hip hop fan in the world. Like, I do like the genre. There's loads of people in there that I absolutely love. People like Eminem and Kendrick, probably two of the most cliched picks I could go for, but I love their work. When it comes to British hip hop, I've never really been able to get into it. Back when I was about 12 or so, I liked Tiny Temper and CHIPMUNK and all those big British rappers who were around at the time, but even listening back to those songs, I don't think they're very good, and everything since then I've never really been into. I cannot get into grime, so I was really surprised when I listened to this album by Dave, and not only did I really like it, I thought it was one of the best albums of the year so far. I love the kind of cinematic style to it. It all takes place within like this therapy session, and a lot of the album is about Dave's like insecurities and all the shit that he's been through in his life, and it focuses massively on mental health. And the way it's all kind of brought together in this like almost theatrical sort of feeling, it reminds me a lot of things like To Pimp a Butterfly from Kendrick. Although I do think some of the instrumentation and some of the beats are a little bit cliched and unoriginal, Dave's lyrics and his flow and everything really elevates this album and makes it something definitely worth listening to. I'd probably give this one a strong 8 out of 10. I have been a big fan of Foals for quite a while now. If you've been watching my channel for the last few years, you may remember that their last album, What Went Down, was on my favourite albums of that year list. And although I wouldn't say I loved that album as much as I did when it first came out, I still do really enjoy it. And I love some of their older albums, especially Antidotes, which is probably my favourite album they've ever done. I really like Total Life Forever as well. So I was definitely interested to see what this new album was like, especially after hearing the lead single Exits, which is still my favourite song of the year. I absolutely adore that track. This is of course the first part of their 2-part album. The second part they're releasing later on in the year, and I thought it was really pretty good. I'm not sure I'd say it's one of their best albums. It's probably on the lower end of the Foals discography, but it's still a really damn good album, bringing in lots of different influences from their normal like math rock and funk sort of sound to a more almost new wave sort of sound, especially in all the synthesizers that they've got littered throughout this album. The album is definitely a lot slower than some of their other stuff. There's very few like fast-paced anarchic songs which you kind of expect from them, and I did kind of find that some of these slower songs are kind of forgettable. Really where this album is at its best is when it's being fast and chaotic on songs like Exits and the incredible White Onions. The ballads don't really work as well as these songs, although that's not to say there's any song on this album that I think is particularly bad or anything, and maybe when the second part of this album comes out as a whole, the piece will work a lot better. So yeah, I enjoyed the new Foals album. I wouldn't say it's the best thing they've ever done. I wouldn't say it's even better than What Went Down, but I still think it's a pretty damn solid album, and I'm gonna give it a 7.5. Indoor Pets are a band that I've been following for a long time. They were previously called Get Inuit, and when they were under that name, I saw them a couple times. I own a t-shirt somewhere of theirs. I got a couple of their records when I saw them on tour, and I've just been eagerly waiting their debut album. I didn't expect it would actually come out this soon, to be honest, but now it's here. I'm definitely really happy with it. It's probably a really great display of what these guys do when they're at their absolute best. All the new songs like High and Being Strange are just absolutely incredibly fun, upbeat, fast-paced indie rock bangers. And of course, all the older songs that reappear on this album, most of them are re-recorded, and I think their new re-recordings sound a lot better, a lot more polished. Lyrically, this album has a lot of cynicism and comedic sort of lyrics dealing with things like mental health issues and stuff like that, and I think it's done in a way where it never feels overly depressing or anything. I think lead vocalist Jamie Glass does a really great job of bringing in these kind of more dark, depressing subjects and displaying them in a light where you can listen to it, sing along, kind of have a good time, and also kind of think about it in a way as well. The instrumentations are all really good. There's not actually a single song on this album I'd say I really hate. The song Couch is probably one of my least favourites, but even now I don't think it's particularly bad. If you like your indie rock much more poppy and catchy with a little bit of that like grungy sort of Weezer-esque edge, then I definitely highly recommend Indoor Pet's debut album, and I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. I've been a fan of Blood Youth ever since they released their first album, Beyond Repair. They're one of the few bands in this metalcore / post-hardcore scene that I actually still really enjoy. For the most part, I've kind of been put off by that scene and kind of find it to be a little bit generic, and a lot of the songs in from these bands kind of just seem to repeat the exact same formula. And Blood Youth, I wouldn't say are the most original band in the world, but they do have really solid, well-written songs that kind of elevate them above most of those other bands. So I was looking forward to their new album Starve, but after listening to it a couple times and even seeing the band on the tour for this album, I wouldn't say it's quite as good as their debut. It does go in a little bit more of a like late 90s, early 2000s nu metal sound in a way that bands like Of Mice and Men have recently tried to bring back. And although I can't say it completely falls on its face and doesn't work, I definitely do think it doesn't work as well as it could do. The riffs aren't really as exciting as they were on the previous album. I didn't find any of the lyrics or the hooks to be particularly gripping or anything, but that's not to say this album is bad. It still does what it does really good, and probably better than most bands in this scene. It's definitely a very hard-hitting and mostly memorable album that I did enjoy. I just don't think it really packs the punch that Beyond Repair did, so I'm going to have to give Starve a 7 out of 10. So I've never massively gotten into FIDLAR before, and that's not like me saying I don't like them or anything. I do enjoy them, I've just never got around to really listening to more than a few of their songs. So listening to Almost Free, it was like just deep diving in and listening to something completely new. And it was definitely a very interesting place to start because this is the most different album they've ever done. It still has a lot of that very fast-paced, aggressive skate punk sort of sound of their first two albums, but there's a wide array of different influences and stuff scattered all over the place. I mean, this album starts off with the song Get Off My Rock, which is basically a Beastie Boys song. And there's loads of weird little sonic experimentations throughout this album like that, which I think would work really well. There's not a single song I didn't think was really good on this album, but also I can't say it's the most memorable album at all. It didn't really stick with me. I didn't find myself wanting to go back to it over and over again. So although I do enjoy it and I do think it is a solid album, I can't say it's one that I really felt the desire to go back and listen to over and over again. Who knows, maybe by the end of the year I would have listened to it loads more and it will become one of my favourite albums of the year, who knows. But for now I'm just going to give this album a 7. I have been looking forward to the new SWMRS album for a long time. I really liked their first album, Drive North, and the singles from this album were just so goddamn good. Berkeleys on Fire, the title track of the album, was on my favourite songs of last year list, so I was really looking forward to hearing how it fit on the album and how the rest of the album was. And so far, this is my favourite album of the year. I think this album is really, really damn good. It's way more mature than their previous album. The band kind of go away from that teenage angst, like mum and dad don't understand sort of thing of pop punk that they kind of followed on their first album, and they go into a much more political and social direction, which I think works really well and ends up sounding like a punk band who have something unique and important to say. The instrumentation is all really, really good, much more hard-hitting and aggressive than their previous album, and the vocal delivery takes huge influence from hip-hop, which I didn't expect would work quite this well, but it actually ends up being really interesting and well performed. There's one problem I have with the album. I'd say the slower ballads like IKEA Date don't really work as well, and they do kind of bring the album down a little bit, as it basically just sounds almost the exact same as Lose It, which was a bonus track on their last album. The rest of the album's still pretty damn good, and I don't really have any major issues with it apart from a couple of songs just not being that great. So I'm gonna give this thing a 9 out of 10.
I feel like losing at the end of the day.
So I will admit I've never listened to Emarosa before, so listening to this album was like an introduction for me, and it's definitely their most different album, so it's probably a very strange place to start. It stepped away from the more post-hardcore sound of their previous albums into a much more pop direction, taking heavy influence from things like R&B. It's a very poppy, catchy record full of some really good earworms. I feel like a lot of people are probably going to look at this album and think, oh, they sold out, this isn't as good as their other stuff, and I can kind of understand that, but I guess for me, I'd never really listened to them before, so I don't know what they're supposed to be like, so I just kind of went into this album with an open mind, completely accepting whatever was going to come, and I ended up really enjoying the album. I thought it was a really fun, catchy album, so I'm going to give this thing an 8 out of 10. I've been following Queensy for a couple of years now, since I saw them on the Marmosettes tour a couple of years ago, so I was definitely looking forward to listening to the album, and it's a pretty good, solid punk record. There's not really much I can say about this album. I don't think it's the most unique or interesting thing I've ever heard. It's not groundbreaking, it's just kind of straightforward punk rock, and if you're into that sort of thing, you'll probably get a big kick out of this record. So I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. Growing up in the UK in the early 2000s, it was basically impossible to get away from Busted. They were like the biggest band in the country, and I will admit they were like the first band I ever really got into. I loved their 2 albums that came out when they were first around. They were the first show I ever went to. I really loved them as a kid, and I was excited when they came back a few years ago, although I did think their previous album, Night Driver, was not very good at all. It went into a more synthy 80s pop sort of sound, but it kept kind of the juvenile, almost comedic lyrics of their early stuff, and the two styles didn't work at all. So now we get their new album Halfway There, which is intentionally a throwback album to sort of their early sound, as well as taking influence from a lot of the pop punk bands that influenced them in the early days. It's much heavier than their previous stuff, but lyrically it's just as stupid and juvenile as their early stuff was. Although I do still have a soft spot for this band, and I do still enjoy those first 2 albums just because of how much nostalgia they bring me. I can't say they're a very good band, at least when it comes to the lyrical aspect. They're good at writing a catchy hook, they're good at writing really good instrumentation, which although is very, very simple, it's memorable, it's catchy, but lyrically they're not good songwriters when it comes to lyrics, and I think that's what brought this album down massively for me, because listening to this album now, I just constantly kept thinking of some of the lesser pop punk bands of that scene that were really popular, like Good Charlotte and Simple Plan, and I kept thinking about all the things I dislike about them, and a lot of those things kind of presented themselves on this album. I will admit there are some songs that I did come out really enjoying, like the song What Happened to Your Band and Radio, two really catchy standout tracks. But for the most part, this album kind of seems to be being busted, but also kind of not growing and just kind of expanding upon the worst parts of their early stuff. It doesn't feel like they've grown up, doesn't seem like they've matured, they're just kind of trying to do the exact same thing again. And yeah, now I'm older and looking at it with a fresh perspective, I can't say I really like it that much. So I'm going to give this thing a 5 out of 10. I remember Drenge were kind of getting big a few years ago, and then they just kind of disappeared, and I was really confused. I didn't know where they went, and even when they announced this new tour and the new album and everything, no one really seemed to pay much attention. And I don't know why, because Strange Creatures is probably their best album to date in my honest opinion. It has a lot of that punk rock sound that was very evident on their first two albums, but there's a lot more post-punk influences scattered all throughout the place. Listening to this album reminded me a lot of sort of almost early New Order sort of stuff when they were just coming off the back of Joy Division, where they weren't quite a synth pop band yet. They still had a lot of that post-punk edge to them, but there's also a lot of synthesizers in there. Still got that snotty, snarly vocal delivery, but the instrumentation is much more synthy and 80s inspired, and I think it ends up being really fascinating and interesting to listen to. I wouldn't say every single song is perfect, there's definitely some songs that are very forgettable, but I had an absolute blast listening to this thing, and if you get a chance I definitely recommend checking them out live, because I saw them very recently on the tour for this album, and they were really damn great. So I'm gonna give Strange Creatures an 8 out of 10.
Give me that guitar and throw me in a crowded room, sheep.
Oh, dear God, no!
And now finally we get to two albums which I've kind of been putting off reviewing for a couple reasons. Mostly because I'm planning on talking much more in depth about these two sometime in the future, and I didn't kind of want to dedicate like a short 5-10 minute review to them because there's so much I want to say about these things. So I'm just going to briefly go over my opinion on the Teal album and the Black album.
A scrub is a guy that thinks he's fly and is also known as a buster.
I've made it no secret that I'm a huge Weezer fan. I've talked about them multiple times on this channel. They're one of my favourite bands. I really did not like Pacific Daydream, so I was very skeptical about this new album, although going into it I did actually really enjoy the single Can't Stop the Hustle and Zombie Bastards. But before we get to Black album, we of course have to talk about the Teal album, their covers album, which they surprise dropped earlier in the year. I didn't think their Africa cover was that good. Everyone seemed to be raving about it, but I just listened to it and was like, it's Africa, but sung by Weezer. It's like nothing really that special. And listening to this whole album I was like, yeah, this is that song but with Rivers Cuomo singing it. This is basically a karaoke album with Rivers Cuomo singing the songs. Like, the instrumentation they recreate completely identically except for the song Happy Together, where they actually do a more Weezer-esque sort of sound to it. But everything, I just felt like I can be listening to the original song, it would be a lot better. Rivers Cuomo has a good voice, but he doesn't have like a large range or anything, so listening to him do songs like Sweet Dreams and then No Scrubs, and then I think it's Billie Jean they do on this album, you never feel like, oh wow, he's got a huge range, he can achieve all this stuff. It literally just sounds like him singing very straightly, very much like he's bored, while the rest of the band just do their best to absolutely recreate everything about these original tracks. I felt like this album was just absolutely pointless, and I think it's probably one of my least favourite Weezer albums, to be completely honest, so I'm gonna give this thing a 3. I wish I could say better things about the Black album, but I really cannot. This thing is just one of the most uninteresting uninspired and bland things that I've heard in the last couple of years. There are a few moments on the album where it's obvious that they're trying to do something unique and different. Songs like Can't Stop the Hustle I thought was a really solid sort of funky song, which was unlike anything I've ever heard from the band. Even the song High as a Kite was a really cute little ballad which I thought worked really well. But the majority of this album is just the average Weezer pop thing. You know, it's just everything we heard on Pacific Daydream, it's everything we heard on things like Raditude. It's nothing unique, nothing fresh. I didn't come out the album being like, wow, there was loads of really great songs on there. I came out the album like, okay, there was a couple of songs on there I liked, but nearly everything was super forgettable. Nothing really stuck in. And the things that did stick in, for the most part, it wasn't for a good reason. This album is just absolutely terrible. I honestly think this is very close, along with Raditude, as being my least favourite Weezer album. Every time I listen to this thing, I'm like, maybe it'll grow on me now, and it does the complete opposite. I hate it even more every time I listen to it. I'm looking forward to talking more in depth about it so I can explain what it is that I truly despise about this thing, but for now, 2 out of 10. Thanks for watching this little video. Sorry that I haven't really been uploading a lot recently. I'm planning on changing that very soon. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.